The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ben Russell. I'm Director of Communications at the Charities Aid Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us this morning on our webinar into our ongoing research into the reaction of donors and charities to the coronavirus pandemic. We have more than 100 people logged onto the webinar at the moment. We're going to talk for a couple of minutes before we get into the meat of this to allow the other people who've signed up to join us. But we're really pleased so many people could join us today because we want to share our research and we want it to be useful for everybody in the charity sector and beyond to inform debate, help people plan, help people have the best possible response to this. So we hope everybody's keeping well. We're all learning to do webinars and online events at the moment. So we hope you enjoy this, find it informative, and we hope we're going to do a good job for you this morning. At CAF, you know, as many of you know, we're constantly conducting research through our monthly UK Giving Tracker survey. We survey 1,000 UK adults every month with our partners YouGov, and we monitor how people donate to causes, what their attitudes are to giving, how they give, what different causes they support, in order to provide an overall assessment of the scale of giving in the UK, the tremendous generosity of the public here in Britain, and to show trends over time. We regularly survey charities, which allows us to talk to the enormous number of charities which CAF supports and other organisations in the sector deal with. Those that use our financial services at CAF, those that receive donations for CAF and others, to try and take the temperature and find out what's concerning people right now. As you can imagine, we started polling donors and charity reaction to the COVID-19 crisis absolutely as soon as after lockdown started. And so even in the last few short weeks, we've built up quite a big body of evidence which we wanted to share with you today, showing how charities are coping, what they're finding, what their challenges are, but also how donors are coping, how they're reacting to this crisis, and how that's being shown in their behaviour and their giving. As always, all our research is published online and for free in order to support the charity sector and others in this world. And you can find that on the CAF website, cafonline.org. You can sign up to our research, subscribe to our publications, so you get the latest from us straight into your inbox, and we do monthly and regular updates on what we're finding out there. What we've done to try and help everybody navigate through this crisis, we've put our coronavirus insight all in one place, which is at www.cafonline.org/COVID-19 research. We'll flash that up at the end, but you can visit that page, subscribe, and see what the latest is from us. And you can subscribe to all our research, which we really encourage you to do because we make it available for free to help you. We're up to about 170 people signed on now, so we can start getting into the meat of this and really hope you find it useful. Have a look at the bottom of your screen. There's a questions window, which on my iPhone has got a little question mark on it. So if you've got questions for us to answer at the end, please type them in there, and my colleagues will go through them and we'll do our best to answer everybody's questions as best we can. That's really useful. And at the end, there'll be opportunities to feedback on this webinar so that you can tell us whether or not you found it useful, things we could do better, because we want to make it as helpful as possible. So what we're going to do this morning is we'll have a summary of the latest trends in research from my colleague Susan Pinkney. Susan's CAF's head of research. She's got a 20-year track record in commercial and public sector market research, analysing behaviour change, analysing trends in behaviour and the impact of various interventions. We're very lucky at CAF to have her insights into giving trends. So Susan will go first and talk about what we're finding from a market research point of view, first of all. We'll also hear from Rodri Davis, my colleague, who's CAF's head of policy. Rodri is much in demand as an advisor and speaker to government events, businesses, charities, philanthropists. He's done a huge amount of work analysing philanthropy over the years and through history, actually. And his book, Public Good by Private Means, he won't mind me saying, is available at all online good bookshops. Rodri will talk us through some of the latest thinking that we've been doing about how to release funds and encourage giving to help charities build their way out of this crisis when we finally come out the other side, and has also been doing a bit of thinking about what the crisis will do to the charity sector and the landscape for giving. You know, we're asking some questions that we think are really important, that we can think about how we can get charities and our entire voluntary sector out of this crisis in as strong a place as we can. Because obviously, as we all know, the work of charities is needed now, absolutely massively, and will be needed more than ever when we finally get out of this situation. So obviously, please make good use of the question button at the end, and we'll answer any questions you can. But we'll do our best to answer them and add to the insight that we've got. The questions that we can't answer are also really useful because it will help inform the research that we're doing all the time in order to try and understand what's happening and share that with all of you. So I'm going to hand over to Susan now. Susan, give us a sense of how the charity sector has reacted, how donors are feeling, and what should we all be taking away from the research, what should we be doing, thinking about how we respond to it.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this relatively sunny Thursday. As Ben said, we've been doing quite a lot of research since the outbreak started. Round about the 17th of March, I think, was the first emergency research that we did, mostly in the UK, although we are expanding that more globally as of around about this week, so more of that soon. I'm really just going to give you a flavour of the things that we've seen, along with some recent data that we've got that at the moment is unpublished. And as ever, I don't want to bombard you with too much data. If you want a lot more numbers, as Ben says, you can find that on our website. So moving on to what is the public mood. So firstly, I want to have a look at how the public are behaving. I mean, we've been doing a lot of our own research within CAF, but I would really recommend to everyone that if you're interested in more detail, you also go and have a look at what's going on more widely in terms of mood. And obviously, charity is part of everything that's going on in the world, but I think it's really important to understand the kind of broader mood and sentiment that's going on, which gives a lot of clues as to why things are happening and how individuals are behaving in terms of giving and interacting with charity. Lots of research agencies are providing access to this data for free at the moment. We have got links on our research section. I'm just going to talk you through some of the things I think are quite key in terms of broad background. So moving on to the next chart, how are our adults feeling during this crisis? This is looking at some data from the research agency Savanta carried out in the last couple of weeks. Without going on to what's in this chart at the moment, actually, just to say that we are tracking this pretty much on a daily basis. Someone in our team is kind of doing horizon scanning every single day. And I'm pleased to say that for the first time yesterday, we saw that people are starting to feel a little bit happier across the country. Having said that, we're nowhere close to norm. I think the norm is 50% happy. We're at 38%, but that was as low as 21% in mid-March. So there is a little bit of some positive signs coming through, although frustration and anxiety are still pretty high and are the emotions that are most likely to be given for how they feel at the moment. So specifically on this chart, 53% are saying they're telling us they're very worried about coronavirus. And I think what's particularly key to charity is that 2 in 5 people saying their disposable income has decreased. Now, what we often say in relation to giving to charities, it's a choice. I think most of you on this call will be aware of this. People have a choice whether they give to charity or do other things. So it's clearly of concern that for 38%, there's been a decrease in disposable income. You've also got 1 in 5 people saying that they've been furloughed from their jobs, 18%, which presumably for most means that they've taken a bit of a job cut there. So in terms of the money that's available, and also this kind of overlying sort of feeling of job security and feeling that that's quite low, are all going to be contributing factors to whether people feel that they're able to donate to charity at the moment, at a time where charity needs money more than ever. So moving on to see whether there's an appetite to give more or less to charities as a result of the crisis. So we asked people, and this is towards sort of mid-March, so when emotions were particularly high, to what extent, if at all, are you likely to do each of the following in the near future? And talking about really the kind of next 3 months as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. And we see that 22% are saying that they will give more than usual, but I think it's really key to note that 14% are saying that they will give less. So I think the key to any fundraisers out there, any charities out there, is to try and find who these people are who are able to give more. There's a huge section of society that are really worried and think that they were going to get, and are also saying that they will give less to charity. So it's really trying to find who these people are who do have a bit more disposable income and who do want to give more, which is still by far the minority of the population. And so what we wanted to also do is see if people are giving differently. And if I'm being honest, in the past when we do UK giving questions, what are NHS charities would just be absorbed into the codes that we put out there for health. Given there's been lots of talk about NHS charities in particular, we really wanted to pick up on this and understand it in a bit more detail. So we asked, this is from unpublished data, hopefully you can see the fieldwork dates. This was conducted last week with YouGov, and so it's pretty hot off the press. But we wanted to understand how likely people would give to certain cause areas as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. And if you just look at the length of the blue bars on those charts, you see that it's NHS that comes out on top at 42%. That's exactly the same level as we saw when we asked this question a month previously. That hasn't really changed. Local charities has, however, gone up a bit in the last month. So that's now at 41%. That was in the high 30s when we asked a month previously. You have 28% saying that they're likely to give to national and only 14% giving to international causes. So there's really clear areas of differentiation in this. And I think the key thing to take out of this is people really still are giving close to home. International charities hasn't changed month on month. It's 14% this month saying they're likely to, and a really large number saying that they're not very or not at all likely to, so 52%. So there's been a real sort of shift, I think, in terms of people giving as close to home as possible, and specifically to NHS charities. I think another thing just to say is that more broadly in the research that we do on UK giving, what we both often see and talk about is about the UK population being really generous in responding to disasters and appeals. But I think the key thing here is that this disaster is on our own doorstep, and it is still at the moment. I think we will get to a point where people start to recognise and start to see further afield and start to recognise the value in giving more internationally again. But for now, and certainly from this data that was just taken last week, I just don't think as a population we're quite there yet, which obviously isn't great news for any international charities that are on this webinar. And then just looking a little bit beyond money, what are individuals doing? So we asked which, if any, activities would you be likely to do to provide help during this time? And the news will tell you this. So these are just the stats behind it really. And again, this is from towards the end of March. You've got over half of people saying they'll help a friend or neighbour with the shopping, half saying they'll check on vulnerable neighbours, and then round about 2 in 5 saying they'll look out for people in their area. So there is a kind of sense of community and helping out in the community. Beyond that, people are, in terms of help that they might give, you've got 1 in 5 saying that they'll use social media to provide or coordinate help in the local community. About 1 in 5 also saying they'll join a local group set up to help deal with the crisis, and around 5% saying they'll set up a local group. So I guess what this is saying is all the things we're hearing out there about sense of community and helping each other is being borne out by the data. So that was individuals. I'm just going to quickly talk about how charities are feeling. On the individuals questions, we've been using our UK Giving monthly tracker, as Ben said, to collect the data. For the charities, we've been trying to send out things quite quickly as and when a topic comes up. So we've been sending out pulse questions at least once a week, so 1 or 2 questions. We're getting response rates of about 500 charities, just to really get point in time of how they're feeling. So this first question is about demand. So asking people, and this was relative, under the current scheme of things, relatively long time ago. This was at the start of April we asked this question, and we saw that 25% had said that they'd seen an increase in demand. I think I've got some verbatim comments on the right hand side there that hopefully you can read. But just to read some out in case they're not too clear, we have people saying things like, we have a greater need for our services now and are in more need for funding to sustain our services. The biggest impact on our funds is a fall in our investments. In addition, we're receiving high requests for grants from the elderly community. And when we asked for verbatim comments, we got lots of really rich information on that. People really wanted to tell us what was happening, but there's a clear increase in demand. I haven't charted this up, but I think it's quite interesting to know as well that at the end of March, this was before the government announcement of the £750 million and some of the other initiatives, but we asked people whether, assuming no further help was forthcoming, whether it be from the government or anywhere else, how long they could continue to operate in their current form. And we saw 54% said 12 months or less, and within that 37% said up to 6 months. So that's quite a sobering statistic, really, if 37% were saying they didn't think they could survive in the current format up to 6 months. So real concerns there amongst the charities we spoke to. We also asked, and this is quite recent, this is from the 16th, 17th of April, schemes that charities are likely to use, and this was as more and more schemes had been introduced. We saw that 35% saying that they planned to use the job retention schemes. That's 1 in 3 saying they plan to use what was commonly known as the furlough scheme. That was by far the highest thing that people said they would use, followed by 18% saying they use the business rate relief. I guess this is a bit of a catch-22 around furloughing, because as many of you on this webinar will know, and something we're hearing all the time, is that there's a huge rise in demand for services. So if you're a charity helping older people with advice, for example, or you're a food bank, you really need your staff in order to be able to provide the service to deliver. And so we did actually ask at the same time as this, so 17th of April, whether letting furloughed employees return to the organisation as a volunteer would help them to survive. And a quarter of people said it would, which is pretty interesting, because as I said before, you furlough employees, they can't work for any organisation, charity or otherwise, but the demand is there and it's needed. So that was a very whistle-stop tour of the things we've been asking. Hopefully you found it interesting. I'm going to hand you over to Rodri for now. I can see there's some questions come in, but I think I'll just leave them to the end after Rodri's spoken, and we can address those. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Susan, and thank you to everybody for dialing in various ways today. Anybody that I have met before, hello, good morning, and anybody that I haven't, it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you today. Yeah, I just want to pick up and talk a bit, following on from what Susan said about what we have been thinking in terms of trying to kind of interpret some of the work that we've been doing, the research work at CAF, and also what we've been finding from conversations with others across civil society in the charity sector, within government and elsewhere. And And I've been doing on the podcast that we do at CAF, the Giving Thought podcast, a series of sort of short conversations with people across civil society, trying to get kind of views from a range of people about what's currently going on and what they're finding about the major challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, which have been really interesting. So on the first slide, I think, which is coming up now, I just want to talk through what we're sort of seeing as some of the key trends affecting civil society right now that should be sort of informing the response in the short term, and also I'm going to go on to talk about things we might need to be thinking about in the kind of medium and longer term. So the first point, which I think will not be surprising to anyone on this call, and certainly reflects what you'll have seen in the figures that Susan was talking about. A lot of charities are obviously facing enormously reduced income at the moment as they have to cancel fundraising events, or are struggling because they're no longer able to open social enterprise cafes and things like that, or able to get fees of various kinds or provide services for local authorities. But at the same time, many organizations are not able to just stop what they're doing or put it on ice or furlough their staff, because they're actually seeing increased demand. So there's a sort of almost unprecedented squeeze, and this is certainly something that we've been seeing from the many applications we've had to the emergency coronavirus grant fund that CAF established, and we're kind of getting money out of the door from at the moment, and I'm sure reflects lots of other people's experience. Another point which I think is really interesting, and it goes to something that might be particularly unusual, if not entirely unprecedented, about the nature of this crisis, is that unlike a lot of previous crisis that you might imagine, where you're asking people to give money to support, it's not so clear a case of something that is affecting one group of people but not affecting another group, and you're asking the people who are largely unaffected to give to help others, which is sort of the model you'd expect if, for example, a disaster had happened overseas. What's actually happening is that we're all affected to one degree or another. So when you're talking to people and asking them to give, the fundraising ask is different and more complex, because we're not talking about us and them, we're talking about us as a whole, and trying to convince people to sort of support others in the same situation as them. And I know from talking to fundraisers, this is something they're trying to think through in terms of their own messaging at the moment. Another thing I think that we're all feeling at the moment, I mean, we're here on a webinar when in other circumstances we might have been physically in a room together, is that for many years a lot of organizations have been thinking through how to engage with new technology and digital tools and go through a process of digital transformation, and struggling to do so, either because they don't have the knowledge or the resources, or it's just not seen as a priority. All of a sudden in the last few weeks, everyone's had to do it in an incredibly short space of time, and I'm sure lots of people feel as though they've managed to do things that they thought were never possible and make them work. I think the interesting question is, does this sort of enforced pivot to digital result in any longer term change in the sector? Does it mean that we kind of in the longer term deliver services that we otherwise would have assumed had to be done offline more digitally? Do we adapt to things like remote working and doing events virtually? And what kind of support do organizations need to have in the longer term to make sure that they're able to do that and avoid some of the pitfalls? Because as well as all the benefits of technology at the moment, I think we're all increasingly aware of some of the challenges that it can raise. Another thing I've heard a lot from talking to funders, and also those who are in receipt of funding from trusts and foundations in particular, but also local authorities and central government, is that whilst it's not universal across those sectors, there has been some really encouraging behaviour change in terms of attitudes towards things like giving unrestricted rather than restricted grants, funding core costs rather than programmatic funding, reducing the requirements in terms of reporting so that organisations don't have as much of an admin burden on them, and shifting to a model where grant making is based on trust between the funder and the grantee, rather than having to have sort of very legalistic relationships that are based on kind of financial reporting. Linked to that, another thing that's very clearly come through from a lot of the conversations I've had is that there's been a huge amount of collaboration, cooperation and coordination within the charity sector and among funders, and people have found that, I think, really encouraging, actually, that everybody has slightly sort of put aside their institutional ego or the desire to make sure their logo's on the top of a piece of paper, and actually work together with other organizations. And the hope is that that can continue into the future. And then another thing I think that is the really kind of interesting trend that's not new to this crisis, because it was happening anyway, but I think has been very sharply brought into focus, is that we're no longer just talking about kind of traditional charities and charitable organizations of the sort that we might expect. I think there are new networks and models emerging, and a lot of the focus actually when people have wanted to do something has been on some of these new kind of mutual aid groups that spring up and are sort of facilitated by WhatsApp, or just doing things over Facebook, or the COVID Mutual Aid UK network that's come up. And the interesting question looking to the future is what that will mean, I think, for the charity sector more broadly. So I just want to move on now on the next slide, just to kind of talk about some of the thoughts we've had about what we could do in the short and longer term in policy terms. And I want to frame this to say, I think there's been an enormous amount of effort in the sector, quite rightly, to push for government to give support for the charity sector directly in recognition of the vital role it plays. But I think alongside that, and the ongoing calls for there to be more funding to ensure charities can access the funding that's already there, I think it is absolutely true that we need to make sure that we have as much philanthropic and charitable giving as possible, and that is as effective as possible. And certainly looking beyond that, there is inevitably going to be a process of rebuilding that's required. And I think philanthropy and charitable giving is going to be a huge part of that. So we put out a paper last week outlining some of our ideas, many of which are things that we wouldn't, to be honest, normally recommend in normal times, but actually these seem like slightly extraordinary times and may well call for sort of extraordinary measures. And I think the political environment has changed so much that ideas that seemed unfeasible maybe even a few months ago are no longer unfeasible. So we've called for things like, I won't go through all of these, but I would encourage anybody who's sort of interested to go away and read the paper, and we can provide links to that at the end of the webinar. But for instance, making gift aid universal by reducing or removing the requirements to have specific declarations for a time-limited period, reflecting something that's been recommended in the US, where they're doing a similar thing to their charitable deduction, or it was called for by a group of non-profit organizations over there, partly just to maximize the value of an existing relief that we all know and love, gift aid, but also to sort of add an extra tool to the tool belt of fundraisers who can then go out and kind of fundraise on the basis that donations will be worth that bit more in the future. I think also just mentioning the national fund there, without going into detail, we know from the work we've done, and certainly my kind of knowledge of the history of the charity sector, there are quite a lot of pots of money out there in trusts and foundations of one sort that have been around for a very long time and no longer really have any purpose. So they're essentially dormant, and there always have been legal issues to getting the money out. But actually the sort of the new imperative provided by the fact that we need money right now to address very short-term funding issues may mean that the political will is there to kind of force some of that through. And the only other one I want to mention is that there's been an idea around for a long time about the idea of living legacies, which is something they have in the US already. It's essentially like making a legacy gift, but without going into technical detail, you're able to do it during your lifetime and retain a sort of financial income so that you can have sufficient security. But in doing so, you might be able to bring forward legacy gifts that would otherwise be made in 10, 20, 30 years and enable charities to know in certainty that they were going to get those, and then potentially be able to borrow against them or plan against them, which might help to answer some of the issues. And we're certainly not saying that any one of these ideas is a silver bullet that would solve all the problems by themselves, but I think as an overall package, they're the sorts of things that could be an important part of the process of getting us through this immediate short-term crisis and getting us into the process of rebuilding. And then just before we go on to open up for Q&A, I just want to talk on this final slide about some of the thinking that we have started to do based on the conversations we've been having and the research we've been doing about what the key questions for the medium and longer term might be. And I should flag up, I just published a blog yesterday, which contains much more detail about these and some other ideas. And also that these are informed to some extent by work I've been doing as well, looking at the historical angle and seeing the way in which previous crises have sort of affected the way philanthropy and charity operates and sort of attitudes to it, which was published a couple of weeks ago. So I think one thing to say is we need to get through this immediate short-term crisis, but one of the big questions for the future is how do we ensure that if something like this happens again, civil society is in a better position to weather the storm. I think, unfortunately, whilst this might feel like a once-in-a-lifetime event, the reality is with the way issues around climate and everything are going, we are likely to see issues of this scale in the future, so we need to give some thought to that. The question I raised before about sort of new models for organising and doing things, I think there's a question about what impact that will have on the charity sector. Are they an opportunity to do things differently, or do they potentially come into competition with traditional charities, and what does that mean about where people are giving? I think I talked already about the pivot to digital. One thing I just wanted to touch on, I think, particularly because I think it's very relevant given the news today about it being Captain Tom Moore's 100th birthday, and on everybody giving congratulations to him there. The fact that he's raised over £30 million through his fundraising efforts is obviously incredible and shows something about the amazing generosity of the British public. But at the same time, I think for a lot of people, it raises some quite difficult questions about what we see as the responsibility of charity to provide and what we see as the responsibility of the state. And I think in terms of how the NHS is funded at the moment, that's a difficult question a lot of people are facing. And then the other one, I won't talk through the others because I want to leave time for Q&A, is just to highlight the second from last one, which touches on something Susan was saying, which is that at the moment we're seeing people kind of giving more locally and to NHS charities. But I wonder, with a view to the future, is there going to be more of a shift to a kind of form of philanthrolocalism, or an idea that charity begins at home and away from a focus on more global issues? I'll leave it there for now because I want to give sufficient time for Q&A. But as I say, please do check out the blog that we've put out for more on all of those.
Thanks, Rod, and thanks, Susan. I think there's some really fascinating insights there into what's going on out there and how people are feeling. We're getting a lot of questions through that we'll go through. The first one we've got is about a comment that Susan made about the furlough scheme, which is probably worth clearing up. There's a very good page on this on the NCVO website, actually, which goes through the details of the furlough scheme, which says that if you furlough staff as a charity, they can't come back and volunteer for you. They do have the option to volunteer for a different organisation. But it's worth Googling the guidance and looking at NCVO, who've done a very detailed page on that, which is really, really useful. As I say, we've had a lot of really interesting questions coming through. On various subjects. I think the first one follows on from something that you've been saying, Rod. Do you think there might be some more a bigger role for decentralised funding for charities at the regional and local level, rather than everything being funneled through national organisations? And you can certainly see that being that desire to help charities close at home reflected in the insight that Susan's done. What do you think? Do you think we're going to see a shift in the way these things are channeled, Rodri?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, and I think as with a lot of things, I can paint two almost entirely different scenarios. I think on the one hand, the fact that we've seen the rise of sort of increasingly hyper-local giving and people wanting to form new neighbourhood and community groups and support those, and are feeling the effects of the pandemic very locally and responding to that, suggests there is a kind of potentially untapped appetite for people to give locally and for that to be something that motivates. But at the same time, I think the desire to make sure that the overall response to the pandemic and the role that charities are playing in it is as effective as possible drives a sort of totally opposite desire for centralisation. So I think you see this in the response of the government at the moment, inevitably, is that they have now provided some money for the sector, and they've moved into the second phase of the challenge, which is how do they get that money out of the door effectively. And in order to do that, I think they want to get it down to the lowest possible level. But the reality is, in order to do that, they want to be working with a sort of small number of organisations or filtering through them. And that leads to a process of kind of centralizing. So I think those two tensions between, do you centralize to make it rational and effective and kind of get the money out quickly, or do you try and go the other way and let as many, 1,000 flowers bloom and kind of have an even more pluralistic civil society in future? I think it's very hard to know which way that will go. I think it'll probably fall somewhere between the two.
Yeah, I think that's right, and we're seeing lots of things happening at the moment, and I think this is reflected in the work that Susan's been doing and our research. Change is happening, and we don't know whether or not they will persist, whether there'll be short-term changes or whether they'll continue in the long run. There's been an interesting question come in, which I think is one for you, Susan, where we've seen lots of examples of increased charitable giving at the moment, as we often see when there are crises in the world, such as the amazing fundraising support for Captain Tom, raising millions and millions of pounds, and virtual fundraising events like the 2.6 challenge the other day. And I suppose the question is, do we think this is just short term, or will we see donor fatigue because people have been giving to these things when we come into the future? As Susan, we've done quite a lot of research on this over the years. Perhaps you might talk a bit about whether or not you think these will be additional or whether they'll persist.
Yeah, and just for anyone that didn't hear the news, for Captain Tom, he got promoted to Colonel for his 100th birthday today. So for those of you that weren't watching Breakfast News this morning. Anyway, yeah, it's an interesting one, this, because we actually did some research with CAF data a few years back with Professors Sarah Smith and Kimberly Scharf, who are economics professors, looking to see what happens when people respond to, it started off as responding to disasters, but we broadened it out to look at appeals and telethons and things like that. And what we saw was a phenomenon, what they saw was a phenomenon where when people give to an appeal, we also see an additionality for other cause areas. So you might give to, for an example, a DEC appeal, but we're also seeing uplifts in things like heart research, cancer, cancer charities, which had nothing to do with the appeal. So there does seem to be something in that around, once you start feeling that you want to give, you will then additionally give to something else. So we haven't seen cannibalization. What I would say with this, and this isn't a kind of get out of jail card, but this is completely unprecedented. There are no norms for this. I'm not sure that looking at previous behaviour, we can predict future behaviour. The behavioural scientists and government aren't doing that at the moment into too far into the future, because they don't have the data on which to base it. So the best data we have is that, which shows that people will continue to give. But I don't think we've ever seen a time where people have been so hard pressed financially, with drops in disposable income and everything. So I think there will be a period where we have to wait for it to kind of plateau and see what happens over the next, say, 3, 4, 5 months, depending on how quickly things change.
We've had that's really interesting, and that's a fascinating piece of work about whether or not fundraising for particular crises substitutes for fundraising for that happens every day. We've had a couple of questions, Rod, about gift aid. How likely do we think it is for our ideas about universal gift aid to happen, and when might it happen? And actually a question about how might be implemented, and how might people take advantage of it. I mean, obviously that's an idea we've put out there, but Rodri, do you think that that's something that might be likely to happen, or find favour?
If I was a betting man, and I'm not, I think I'd probably still shy away from putting any particular money on it. So, I mean, I think the reason that we've put forward that idea is it's an idea that we had worked on quite a lot previously in the past, more driven by the idea that sort of longer term there was an argument for taking advantage of new technological capabilities to make the system of gift aid, which is, in a lot of ways absolutely wonderful, but also is a system that kind of started in a paper-based world and over time has had various bits and pieces added to it and has become quite complex, a bit simpler, so that the estimated 600 million, I believe, that HMRC thinks every year that could be claimed via gift aid and isn't, actually we get closer to making sure that the full value of it's maximized. I think previously those conversations in the past slightly sort of stalled on questions about how it would work and the technological implications of it. I think what we're saying here is actually a slightly different thing. Take the principle of that, the idea that there is some money out there that could be going to charity and in some ways is sort of already earmarked for them, but isn't getting there for whatever reason. And by implementing short-term measures, just kind of relax the requirements to make sure that you evidence the direct link between a donor signing a piece of paper saying that they make gift aid, they want to make a gift aid declaration, and just assume that they have. How that works in principle is, to be honest, to be decided in discussion with others in the sector and those in government. I'm currently talking to quite a lot of people across the sector who are sort of interested in this idea. You know, I mean, one possibility is simply that you could shift from a system where it's essentially opt in to opt out. So you just, you know, like a lot of things, if you assumed that gift aid did apply to a donation and then asked a donor specifically to make the effort to say no, that would obviously flip the model on its head. And whilst government, you know, in other times might not have been so keen on that, it's one of those ideas, I think, where you can make a strong case now because the times are so unusual and the needs within the charity sector are quite so pressing. But certainly if anybody, you know, is interested in that idea and wants to kind of talk further about it or work with us to push forward on it, we'd be absolutely delighted.
I mean, we're getting questions thick and fast now, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. We've got a couple about international giving and whether or not the focus on domestic giving rather than international giving will last, and whether or not we're seeing evidence of charities moving some of their funding overseas. Susan, do you have any thoughts on whether or not this shift between international and domestic giving will change?
Yeah, so I think Ben said at the start, my background's kind of in commercial research, so I'm going to draw on that for now. I think there is a real thing around kind of share of voice at the moment, to be on it, in terms of what's going on. So the NHS are obviously doing a fantastic job at the moment, and lots of people are talking about it. And I think that by virtue of both the emotion around it, and also it's constantly being talked about, people are responding to that because they're hearing about that a lot. I think when you look at something like the international charities, the difference here is that, as I said before, this disaster is on our own doorstep. So you're aware of people dying, you hear about it all the time. So there is something about not hearing about what's going on massively internationally, and I would say with the exception of Europe and the US, which we do sometimes hear about. So unlike if there was a drought in Sudan, for example, in the past, we would hear about it, it would be in our conscious. That's not happening at the moment. So I think that when things start to move on and we start to progress a little bit more, and the news and the share of voice, as it were, starts to become a lot more about what's going on internationally, then I think we might start to see a shift back towards that. But as I said, that the data we have on it hasn't changed from March to April, so it isn't something that's happened yet.
I think that's interesting. We're getting a couple more questions, and we're trying to cover all the ground now about. Obviously, our research, the research shows that there are a lot of people showing a fall in their disposable income at the moment, but some people aren't. They've got more money around, and whether or not there's an opportunity for charities there. And I think there's also a question about whether or not the sort of things that we're seeing here, people supporting Colonel Tom and other causes, would shift why they're giving. Any thoughts on that, Susan?
Yeah, actually, as I saw the question come in on disposable income, and I've been trying to quickly find the data on it, but I can't find it. But we can circulate it when we send around the notes to this. We did actually ask, and you're right, the person that posed this question, there are certain people out there who are getting holiday refunds, are saving on commuting fees, are earning the normal salary, but sitting at home with that normal salary. And so there is a group of people who have seen an increase to their disposable income. It's in the tens of percent. It's between 10 and 20%. I can't remember the exact figures. We will share that. But you're right. I think the issue with that is trying to find that group of people. I mean, what I've been saying is, since the start is, for many people things are really difficult, and they're not the people we should be asking. But for those of us who are in fortunate positions, it probably is the time for us to step up and give more. And I think something that Rodri in particular has talked about on the sort of high net worth level is, if you're waiting for a rainy day, now is this rainy day. And I think that not only applies to high net worth, this is also, you know, people in the fortunate position who are kind of saving money. So as I say, that there is that group, that the issue for the fundraisers in this webinar is going to be identifying them, because they are going to be relatively disparate, and it is quite a low percentage, but that would be the area for me that you'd want to be focusing on at the moment.
There's a absolutely brilliant question from earlier on in the discussion, which I've deliberately left till towards the end, because I think it's really pertinent, talking about, you know, lots of charities furloughing staff, kind of feeling a bit out of the picture at the moment, and the question is, when do we think the second phase of fundraising might come? When's it the right time, and when do we think the recovery for the charity sector might begin? Now, obviously, that's the $64,000 question for us all. When will the recovery for the economy and the country and the health crisis begin? But Susan, Rodri, any idea what are the signs we should look for, you know, to show tell people that we might be turning a corner a little bit on this?
I mean, I'll go first, and then let Rodri sum up. To me, it's watch the data, and I know people were saying you would say that as a researcher, but I do think there is a lot to be said for that data that I presented at the start, which is from the freely available research agency COVID trackers that they're putting out. I think it's watching the trends in that. They're repeating those questions at least 2-3 times a week, and so I think it's looking for things to start to shift. So I think I mentioned that we're happier this week, for example, and I think it's looking at those measures which are around things like starting to feel a bit more comfortable, starting to feel less like your job's at risk, and looking for those kind of external indicators which indicate that we then are going to feel a bit happier about spending money again. I mean, that wouldn't just apply to charity, that would apply, you know, across sectors across the board. But I very much advise keep an eye out on that and look for when things start to move. Rodri?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just picking up on that question, which I think Lizzie asked. So hello, Lizzie. Sorry, I know Lizzie, so I have to say hello. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a good point, and it's something that we're certainly seeing in the conversations about how money is distributed, either that sort of government money or philanthropic money. I think it's easy for the default to be, it has to be money that is going to the front line in some sense, or organizations working directly on the response to COVID, which is absolutely understandable. But the reality is that actually a lot of the sort of wider economic impacts are being felt by organizations working on all kinds of causes across, you know, charity and civil society. And it might well be difficult for some of those organizations to make that case at the moment. I absolutely agree. And I'm seeing this, you know, with a lot of arts charities or charities working in kind of, you know, the wildlife sector or the animal sector. I think it's difficult to know at what point that balance shifts. I think they kind of need to continue to make that case to their existing supporters that, you know, even if they're not on the perceived front line, they do need to continue their work, or to be able to kind of be in a position to pick that up when we get out the other side of this. Just to pick up very quickly on two other things there. I mean, on the question of whether some people have more to give, I think that's absolutely right. I think, as somebody pointed out in the question, it's a difficult fundraising ask, but I think it goes to what I was saying about the nature of this crisis, which is, even if you're talking about you know, we're all being affected by this, I think we have to find ways of making the point that actually different people are affected in different ways and to different levels of severity. So actually, there are, you know, those of us who are able to give and support do need to recognize that some people are struggling, you know, very seriously at this time. And then just on the question about Tom Moore and his fundraising, there was an interesting point somebody said about what does this mean about sort of future fundraising, and whether it's more people responding to his personal story. I think this is one of the fascinating questions about the more we shift towards sort of person-to-person fundraising or crowdfunding. It's great in a lot of ways, and it can get a lot of money going because you get these sort of viral campaigns because people feel that connection. But actually, do people then start to make choices about where to give solely based on who has the most compelling story or the best social media campaign? And actually, what does that mean for causes that are difficult to present in that way, but actually, you know, just as important, or where the need is even greater? So I think, you know, that is something that we're going to have to kind of grapple with as we move into the future as well.
I'm gonna squeeze the time a little bit to squeeze in the last three in a quick fire round. There's a question about whether or not different types of charities are suffering more than others. There's a question about whether funders, if they spend money now, whether there'll be a funding drought in a couple of years. And then there's a really good question about what the sector's role will be in the recovery. More sustainability, more collaboration, more alliances, and so forth. Susan, Rod, do you want to say a very quick word about that, and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. As I said in the previous thing, I think different parts of the sector are being hit differently, depending on whether they're seeing increased demand, whether people perceive them as part of the front line or not, whether their business model, I mean, they're more reliant on trading or sort of large scale fundraising events. And I think it would be good for all of us to understand that so that we can know where the hot spots and sort of spots where perhaps organisations are feeling the pinch less are. I think as we move into the future, absolutely the role for kind of the charity sector and the funding sector to help us move beyond it and rebuild will be vital. I think one of the things that I'm most interested in about trying to find some time, even as the sort of short-term issues are almost overwhelming, to look up a bit and think a bit about the future, is that even if you can't say with any certainty what that future is going to be, if you start to map out what some of the potential scenarios are and then work backwards to what it means in terms of what we need to do now, we stand a better chance of going towards the future we actually want to see, and to be honest, taking the opportunities to rebuild and reshape where we think that's what's required, rather than necessarily just aiming to go back to business as usual. If there's an opportunity to do things differently, why not take it?
I think that's really a good point on which to end, Rod. And thank you, Rodri, and thank you, Susan, for the insights, which I hope everybody has found helpful. We have three next step follow-ups from this, really. The first is that we do have another webinar session on May the 14th from our charity advisory team, who are looking at the massive question of how to build charity resilience at times like this. We've been running a resilience program for some time now, so they want to share some of their learnings and their expertise, and Susan will also be on that to share the latest insight that we've got, because we're getting more all the time. We'll email around the details to you with the recording, a link to the recording of this session, and we'll post these slides online. I'm very sorry, some of them seem not to render very well on mobile, so we'll post those as well so you can see the full slides. The other thing is that one of the things we do at CAF is we coordinate Giving Tuesday in the UK, and the global organisers of Giving Tuesday have put together a Giving Tuesday Now event online on May the 5th to highlight what everybody's doing, and it's really an opportunity to thank everybody in the sector, all the key workers, all the volunteers, all the voluntary sector workers, and join in what we hope is a global thanks to everyone supporting each other. So do Google Giving Tuesday Now, hashtag Giving Tuesday Now, and get involved so that we can really shout about what everybody's doing, because there's so many examples of people doing fabulous work to really support everybody at this time. So thanks ever so much, both to Rodri and Susan, and thanks to all of you for tuning into the podcast today. Please feel free to go online, download and use our research, which will update all the time. Hit the subscribe button and then you'll get it straight to your inbox. And you'll also see a wealth of other information there about that CAF has pulled together about support for charities during the coronavirus outbreak. And the other support we offer for charities all the time. So thank you very much indeed for tuning in. Please fill out the little evaluation form at the end, because we're feeling our way with this, and so any advice you can give us is most welcome. But thanks again for your time. Keep safe. Do feel to download the resources we've got, and best of luck with the rest of the lockdown.